Hélas, madame, celle que j'aime tant, souffrez que soit votre humble servant, votre humble servant, je serai à toujours, et tant que je vivrai, autre n'aimerai que vous, et tant que je vivrai, autre n'aimerai que vous.
Welcome to this series of short podcasts about the stories of the Tudors. My name's Tony Riches and I'm a historical fiction author from Pembrokeshire in Wales, and I'm a specialist in the history of the early Tudors. I've written 3 books which feature Henry VIII from his birth at Greenwich Palace on the 28th of June 1491 right through to his middle age, but I've never written a book about Henry VIII. I think it's been done so much, I'd rather look at the people that surrounded him. But I was recently interviewed by Tudor specialist and author Natalie Greenidger and asked to describe King Henry VIII in one word. I said tyrant without thinking about it a huge amount, and that made me think. So in this podcast I'll be trying to see behind the popular image of Henry, and of course he's best known for his 6 wives, but I'll be talking about them another time, because this time I'd like to consider what have made him such a tyrant over his 38-year reign. The immediately recognisable portraits by Holbein of King Henry VIII show him as a powerful man, perhaps overweight, and it's easy to forget that he was once a playful Renaissance prince, admired for his good looks, and he was actually clean-shaven for most of his youth. And Henry followed his maternal grandfather. He was tall for his time, about 6'3", and he had an athletic build thanks to his love of jousting and hunting and playing tennis, the early form of tennis. And it was said that he could shoot an arrow further than many of the full-time archers and could keep dancing long after everyone else was completely exhausted. And his early years were spent in the nursery at Eltham Palace, and it's quite easy to imagine how, as the only boy surrounded by women, he would have easily been spoilt and indulged. He was known as My Lord Harry, and he had the best tutors, notably the poet and author John Skelton, who's famous for writing poems praising himself. And Skelton wrote a handbook of princely behaviour for Henry VIII, which was called the Speculum Principis, or a first mirror. And this was full of helpful advice for the young Henry, including some of them we can smile at with the benefit of hindsight. Above all, loathe gluttony was one of his warnings. And another one was, choose a wife for yourself and prize her always and uniquely. And it's interesting to think to what extent Skelton influenced the young Henry and shaped his thinking, because people generally tend to forget that Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon for 22 years, which is longer than his 5 other wives all put together. And poor Catherine's marriage to him seems to be quickly forgotten in the rush to look at the others. But Henry became fluent in at least 3 languages, and he had an impressive knowledge that spanned everything from theology to medicine. He used to concoct his own cures for things and get involved in long debates about theology. And he was also the first King of England to write and publish his own book. And in 1521, he published a book which he called The Defence of the Seven Sacraments. This was his response to Martin Luther's challenging the Pope's authority with his 95 Theses. And it was 30,000 words long and became a bestseller. So most people don't think of Henry VIII as a best-selling author, but the Pope did, because he was so impressed that he awarded Henry the title Defender of the Faith, which he was quite proud of, actually, and would remind people of that whenever they questioned his commitment. It's also important to remember that he was never properly prepared for the throne, in that his older brother Arthur should have succeeded the throne on his father's death. He died in 1502 at Ludlow Castle from the sweating sickness, it's thought, when he was 15, leaving Henry as the only male heir. And of course this was compounded by the death of Henry's mother on her birthday the following February. And David Starkey, a historian, suggests that the similarities in their handwriting show that Henry's mother might have been the one who taught him to read and write. Obviously, Henry's handwriting is much kind of stronger than Elizabeth of York's, but it shares the same characteristics, which suggests a particular closeness which he frankly didn't have with his father. And there's in the National Library of Wales, there's a late 15th century illuminated manuscript. It's actually written in medieval French called the Vaux Passional. And it's thought to show the young Prince Henry grieving at his mother's bedside. And if it's true that this grieving little boy, heartbroken for his mother, is Henry, it does say something about his silence on the subject, which he kept silent for many years until he wrote to Erasmus about learning of the death of the King of Castile. And he wrote, "Never since the death of my dearest mother has there come to me more hateful intelligence. Your letter seemed to tear open the wound to which time has brought insensibility." I'd just like to pause here for a moment to comment on something that struck me when I was doing my research on the remarkable similarities between Henry, or Prince Harry as he was known, and his modern namesake. When you think about it, both have a flawed relationship with their fathers, so were very much influenced by their mothers, and in both cases their mothers died suddenly when Henry VIII was 11 and when the current Prince Harry was 12. Both are red-haired, over 6 feet tall, and more athletic and frankly more popular with the people than their more serious brothers, and neither expected to become King of England. And I just think that's such a combination of coincidences, even though they're not connected by blood. It's quite intriguing. Anyway, to return to Henry's story, after the death of his brother and his mother, it seems that his father became very overprotective, and it was typical of Henry VII. He liked to control things, and he certainly controlled the young Henry. And the Spanish reported, "He is never permitted to go out of the palace except for exercise through a private door leading to the park. At these times he is surrounded by those persons especially appointed by the king as his tutors and companions, and no one else on his life dare approach him. He takes his meals alone and spends most of the day in his own room, which has no other entrance than through the king's bedchamber. He is in complete subjection to his father and grandmother," that be Margaret of Beaufort, "and never opens his mouth in public except to answer a question from one of them." It's possible that the death of his brother Arthur at the age of 15 and this overprotection from his father might have led to Henry suffering from a form of hypochondria, because his fear of illness, of catching in particular the sweating sickness, was so great that he asked his physicians to examine him every morning of his life, and he never would allow anybody that suffered illness in his presence if he could avoid it. In fact, he went to great lengths to avoid them, travelling halfway across the country sometimes. And he tried to learn as much as he could about the medicine of the day, and made his own remedies from a secret cabinet of ingredients that he kept in his private apartments. And he had a terrible fear of the plague and the sweating sickness. We have to remember both of these were rife in England at its time, and particularly in London, where he spent a lot of his time. So when a bout of the sweating sickness arrived in London in 1517, Henry left the city for a full year and was hardly seen at all. His first serious accident happened in 1524, when Charles Brandon, who is the subject of my next book, was chosen to joust against the king. Now, Henry was very proud of the armour he was wearing because it was of his own design, and Brandon was wearing a jousting helmet which really obstructed his vision. It is recorded that he could hardly see what was going on, which isn't very good for somebody that's carrying a lance and charging at the king. But it's said that Henry failed to lower the visor on his own helmet, and Brandon's lance, which was designed to shatter on impact, entered the inside of the king's helmet and shattered just above the king's right eye, sending splinters everywhere. And of course, all the courtiers thought that was the end of the king, and probably the end of Charles Brandon as well. But Henry, in typical style, immediately forgave Brandon, and it's recorded that he called his armourers, put all of his pieces together. That means put on his armour again that had probably been taken off, and he took a spear, which is a jousting lance, and ran 6 courses very well, by which all men might perceive that he had no hurt. And it's recorded this was a great joy and comfort to all his subjects there present. It was particularly a great joy and comfort to Charles Brandon, who at the time swore that he would never joust against the king again. And after this incident, though, it is a case that Henry VIII suffered from migraine headaches and insomnia, possibly problems with his memory, but most worrying of all is an apparent inability to control his impulsive behaviour. He always was impulsive, but from then on, it seems from the court records that he could be particularly impulsive. Interestingly, it was also reported that he was absent from court with what seems to have been a leg ulcer soon after the accident. Now, people have theorised that this might have been caused by the fashion for wearing a tight garter on his leg to show off the calf muscle, and of course they didn't really understand what to do to cure it. But the changeability of Henry caused constant anxiety for his courtiers and the ambassadors that always seem to be present, and it's their records which add a bit of colour to the otherwise quite straightforward court records. They note his unpredictability and the way that he could often become furious over the least thing, and the reasons for his anger were rarely obvious to his ministers and advisors. Interestingly, I found something when I was looking at the work of John Skelton. Sadly, most of his books haven't survived, but amongst the other advice, there's an advice to take care about heeding the advice of ministers and advisors because they don't always know for the best, which I thought was an interesting one. But sadly, Henry began to suffer from bouts of depression and what they called self-pity, which and gloom, and all of these things these days would be diagnosed as various forms of mental health problems, I think. But it was another jousting accident which led to his permanent leg injury and prevented him from exercising, and it's after then that he put on weight. And the accident happened at a grand tournament at Greenwich Palace on the 24th of January 1536. Now Henry was 44 then, in full armour, and he was thrown from his horse, which that would have been bad enough, but then the horse fell on top of him, and for most people that would have been the end, because you can imagine the hectic confusion of a tournament, a sudden silence as everybody realises what's happened. And they did think he was not going to recover from that. There's various reports, and it's said that the fall left him speechless for 2 hours. And Anne Boleyn received a message that he would die, and she says that the shock of that news caused her to miscarry the child she was expecting, which sadly was a male. And it's after this that Henry said they would never have male children together, and began to turn against her. And 6 months after that, Anne had been executed, and Henry married the third of his 6 wives, Jane Seymour. But although he recovered, that was the end of his jousting career. And of course, we can't be sure, but it may have caused some kind of brain injury, which brought on his personality change and began to make him into the tyrant that I described him as. And interestingly, historian Tracy Borman, who's the Joint Chief Curator at Historic Royal Palaces, says that the idea that the king was knocked unconscious for 2 hours comes from a report by a foreign ambassador who was actually in a different country at the time. So none of the eyewitnesses mention anything of the sort. And I think, like with a lot of things, it's kind of entered the mythology of Henry VIII. And we need to at least bear in mind that it could have been a much lesser injury and not really quite the turning point in his life that most people make it. But I read a report by a neurospecialist, and he said that even 5 minutes of unconsciousness is considered to be major trauma today. So it is very possible that Henry suffered some kind of brain injury which might have led to the personality change. The other thing is, we shouldn't underestimate what it must have been like for him to have had the aggravated leg problems which really plagued him for the rest of his life. Henry's physicians tried everything to cure his increasingly painful ulcerated wounds, and their idea of cures ranged from keeping the wound constantly open, which of course meant open to further infection, to using potions made of worms and wine. I don't think I'd fancy that myself. So it's little wonder that, far from improving, the king was in constant worsening pain from that time, and that is enough to account for his increasingly foul temper. And what's beyond doubt is that the end of jousting, combined with his leg ulcers and restricted movement, really did lead to him putting on weight. I mean, he had a reputation for a large appetite. There are records of these grand banquets with more courses than you can count. But one of his surviving suits of armour, which is displayed at the Tower of London, has got a waist size of 132 centimetres, which is about 52 inches. And we know from the records that he would often eat a dozen courses at mealtimes, things like chicken and lamb, pork, rabbit, swans, peacocks, venison, all very rich foods. And he drank, it's said, 70 pints of ale a week, as well as innumerable glasses of sweet red wine. So if you imagine anybody these days that drank 70 pints of ale a week, they would probably suffer some kind of consequences. I remember there's one of my favourite authors is C.J. Sampson. In one of his books he describes how Shardlake is present when the king had to be winched up and down stairs on a special engine with chains, which was like the Tudor equivalent of a wheelchair. And it's not really surprising that he could be quite violent and lash out against his courtiers, who were mostly young, fit men, and he might have been a bit envious of them. By the time of his death in 1547, at the age of 56, Henry's thought to have weighed about 28 stone. And interestingly, he, as you might know, he's buried under the aisle of the choir of St George's Chapel, and was therefore present at the current Prince Harry's wedding on the 19th of May. Finally, I'd just like to round off by reminding people that Henry VIII didn't write Greensleeves, which is the one fact that most people seem to know about him. But he was skilled at playing the lute and the recorder, and that records show he owned 78 flutes and 5 sets of bagpipes and a harpsichord, and he did compose a number of popular musical pieces, including 2 of my own Tudor favourites, Hélas Madame, which starts this podcast, and Pastime with Good Company, which is featured in a lively rendition at the end of this podcast by the New World Renaissance Band. The Tudor Trilogy is available from Amazon, and links to all of my books can be found on my website at tonyriches.com. Thank you for listening.
Time with good company I love and shall until I die. Grudge who lust but none deny, so God be pleased thus live will I. For my past tense on sing and dance, my heart is set of goodly sport. For my comfort who shall me lend? Must have some dalliance of good or ill, some pastimes. Company methinks then best, all thoughts and fancies to die